Welcome back to another episode of Creedle, and a special thank you to my guest today, who's also loaning me the use of his technology. We've had Larry, a 30-minute saga of trying to troubleshoot this for today. Yeah. So we tried Riverside, and that didn't work for who knows why. And live webinars was stubborn, but has now finally bent to the will of Larry Chapp, and it's working. So, Larry, thanks
the
for...
The problem is my internet here on the farm is sketchy, and it doesn't want to deal with Riverside, but it handles a live webinar much better for some reason.
Well, good. I'm glad to hear that. Hopefully it works. We have, by the way, a 27-minute show today, and I say 27 because Larry's got a radio interview to do that will give us a hard stop. So, Larry, let's get started.
Yeah, go ahead. Let's go. And we can do a follow-up show.
Yeah,
to
that sounds
finish
great.
This.
Would love to do that, but I will say I've missed our chats. I always learn a lot from you. We were doing really well on a monthly cadence with Creedle. Would love to get you back on that if you're up for it. But things got really crazy. Your Gaudium et Spes blogging has taken off. You're always writing at the Catholic World Report, and as of recently, the National Catholic Register, and doing your own podcast now, and all of this stuff. So we've been very busy, but I'm glad to get you back on the show. How are things in Pennsylvania?
Things are great. Summer is in full swing. The Dorothy Day Catholic Worker Farm is going great after 2 years sort of downtime because of COVID. So things are looking up.
Awesome. Glad to hear it. Well, I was thinking of you the other day because you shared something that you had written on the National Catholic Register, and this was I think it was one of the things that you've written recently that I found most helpful in helping me sort of understand Pope Francis. A lot of our conversations that you and I have had over the past year and a half or so come back to where is the church today, and how should we understand the church of today in the context of the church as she has been since Christ founded her. And your article about Pope Francis was, I think, really helpful in situating where Pope Francis is in the sort of development, I guess we could say, of moral theology, in perhaps the debates of moral theology, especially in the 20th century. And so I thought we could dig a little bit deeper into your contention there, which I think is very plausible. And I have a few comments / thoughts to maybe add to that. And then also I saw that you had another a recent roundtable article with John Cavadini and Stephen White, in which you talked about some recent comments from Pope Francis that I have to say did not sound terribly charitable towards the sort of traditionalist-oriented Catholics in the U.S. So we can maybe talk about that if we have time in this 25 minutes we have remaining.
And by the way, I have another follow-up article in Catholic World Report on those comments from the Pope dealing with what he called the restorationists in the American church.
Is that published yet in the Catholic World Report?
No, not yet. Should be coming out within the next few days. I just sent it to Carl Olson a few minutes ago.
Okay, awesome. Well, I look forward to reading that one. Let's start with the proportionalism thesis that you have.
Yes.
The title of this one is Understanding Pope Francis. It's the Moral Theology Stupid. And I'm going to just give like a 60-second, try to do my best, 60-second overview of your argument here, and you can tell me kind of what I've missed, and then fill out what I've missed after that. So you start out by saying, it's hard to understand Pope Francis. Some people think that he is just, mere continuity from what has gone before. Some people think that he is mere rupture from what has gone before. But both of those narratives really kind of miss the mark. What he is a watershed or a tide-turning moment in the church's moral theology. While he proclaims that he is a son of the church, and he does not, and makes a point to not change anything in the moral law of the church. What he does endorse, or has endorsed, and is moving the church towards, is an embrace of what we might call a proportionalist view of moral theology. And I'm not super read up on this, but I appreciated your pretty concise overview, and we've talked about it before on the podcast, which endorses what we might call a gradualism of the law rather than simply the law of gradualism. The gradualism of the law meaning that, yes, the church has these concrete moral teachings that cannot and will not change, but just how far those apply to you and your specific exigent circumstances from a pastoral standpoint, really depends. And so, yes, we have these hard teachings. Jesus gives us these hard teachings, but you know what? We can't always live up to those. and that's quite okay. In fact, that's not even what Jesus asks of us. Jesus asks us to try to get to heaven, and he asks the church to try to get people to heaven. And probably, I certainly am oversimplifying it, and you might have some sort of nuanced ways of clarifying that. But in support of your thesis about how Pope Francis is embracing this proportionalism, you mentioned several things. One is, his sort of tendency to do things like not change church teaching in Amoris Laetitia, but footnote what could be a pretty substantial application of church teaching in an ambiguous sort of way. Endorse various proportionalists of the church of the 20th century as sort of the leading lights of moral theology for Pope Francis. Replace the faculty of the JP2 Institute in Rome. Get rid of all the Veritatis Splendor JP2 folks and replace them all with those who are more of the proportionalist school, etc. And so this, I think, helps me understand Pope Francis, because it is certainly true that that the sort of the Cardinal Marxists of the world have probably been disappointed that Pope Francis has not straight up ratified their more radical proposals and desires for the church. And yet at the same time, what we have seen is a lot of winking and nodding, and not necessarily even in a conspiratorial sort of way, but more in the sense that Pope Francis is recognizing or is proclaiming, look, this is the moral law, yes, but whether or not we fully apply that or are even able to fully apply that is something that only God himself knows. And so all we can do is sort of try. And I think that's, I mean, I wouldn't say I agree with the Holy Father, but it does help me understand where a lot of his actions come from. So what did I miss in that overview, Larry?
Well, that's pretty exhaustive, and I think that was a really quick. It's a shame we have such little time today, but it's a good overview. I would like to make a very clear statement, though, that maybe doesn't come out quite as clearly as it should in my piece. I'm not claiming that Pope Francis is just an unvarnished, straight-up proportionalist in moral theology, but he just doesn't have the honesty to admit it or something, or he's trying to get it in through the back door. I don't think that he is a straight up proportionalist. Nevertheless, I think so. In other words, the one thing that maybe you got a little wrong, but it's my fault because I wasn't clear, was when you say that I say that Pope Francis embraces proportionalism. I think it's better to say that he uses proportionalist moral thinkers. He uses them for his own purposes. And what I think is that he has a particular pastoral strategy in mind as to where he wants the church to go. And he wants it, I think, to be it's very clear in his statements, very latitudinarian, big tent. Here comes everybody. And with everybody on a kind of sliding scale of holiness from the worst to the best, and that all are welcome at the table of the Lord, and we can embrace everybody where they are in life, while at the same time sort of kind of challenging them to go higher. And I think that what he finds is that priests and bishops and moral theologians that trend in a proportionalist direction are closer to that pastoral strategy that he envisions than old-fashioned natural law moral theologians are. I think he unfairly views those theologians as strict doctrinaire Pharisee.
Rigid, yeah.
Yeah, he uses that language all the time. Strict doctrinaire Pharisees, sticking to their truth. And he often pits truth against mercy, doctrine against praxis, and so on. And so if you look at it, like you said, he praises Bernard Herring as a model for theology. Bernard Herring was a proportionalist. He replaces all the professors at the JP2 Institute with proportionalists. He, in Amoris Laetitia, chapter 8, he says, hey, look, if this is the best you can do, that's God's will for you.
Yep.
That's not straight up proportionalism, but it skirts it, as I say.
Yeah,
it really does skirt it.
I think my question to you, Larry, would be, if that's not straight up proportionalism, then what is straight up proportionalism? Because it sounds like, I mean, if he's saying that the leading light of moral theology is a proportionalist, and he's the JP2 Institute, he's filling it all with proportionalists.
Yep.
He's endorsing what sounds like a proportionalist approach in one of his encyclicals. And what would be different if he was a straight up proportionalist?
I think what would be different is that we would see perhaps changes in church teaching on an official magisterial level in the moral theological domain. I think, in other words, that you might have seen in Amoris Laetitia in its dealings with moral theology more of an overt embracing of that moral theory. and a correcting of John Paul II's condemnation of it, or a nuancing of that condemnation of it. So the fact, in other words, I'll give Pope, in other words, I'm not a Pope Francis hater like so many rad treads and so on. And I'll give him his due here. I think he is a loyal son of the church. He has not, as you said, given the Germans or any other liberal faction of the church their most cherished ideals of women priests, married priests, LGBTQ plus IAA, whatever. He hasn't given them really any of that. Changes in contraception and so on. And I think it's because he sincerely doesn't want to be contradicting settled church teaching on these. But I do think, though, that he has a very powerful conviction, one that I think is incorrect, that the church needs to move in the direction of greater, as I said, latitudinarianism, greater openness to the culture in the world. And I think we've tried that, done that. I think it's actually a mischaracterization and a misunderstanding pastorally of where the church is, that apparently the problem with the church is that it's too rigid and not open enough to the fluidity of the modern world. I would say, Holy Father, with all due respect, that's crazy. Have you not been in these churches?
Yeah.
They're not riddled with traditionalists, and hence his recent comments about America being riddled with restorationist traditionalists is simply empirically false. There are quite a few traditionalists here, but they are an extreme minority. The fact is, the biggest problem in the American church, as with European churches, is exactly the opposite. Okay? We have a laity and a clergy that have completely drank deeply from the well springs of modern secularity, modern bourgeois liberalism. And that's the challenge we need to face. So rather than a more latitudinarian message where, okay, if your circumstances are XYZ, then the moral rules don't really apply to you with full force. That's proportionalism, by the way.
Right.
All right. Rather than that, maybe we ought to be throwing out the challenge of the universal call to holiness, really, putting fire in the equations and preaching a powerful evangelical message. One wonders, for example, why is it that the Catholic Church in the Pope's native Latin America, why are we bleeding, hemorrhaging Catholics to Pentecostal and other evangelical Protestant churches? Is it possibly because they're preaching a message of a robust evangelical sort of conversion to Christ and the churches down there are not? I don't know. But it's certainly, I don't think, something we need to be doubling down on with regard to this more latitudinarian proportionalist approach. And with all due respect to our Holy Father, and he is the Holy Father, I think he's mistaken here.
That makes sense. I agree with almost everything that you're saying. I had an epiphany moment earlier this week. I was speaking with Dominican, and your article came up. Actually, I ended up, he had not seen it, but I ended up sending it to him. Just to, I want to be clear that this is not a Dominican who's ever appeared on the show. I've had a few on, but I don't want to unfairly suggest that this was in conversation with them. This was not one of those who's appeared on the show before. But I was talking with him, and he was talking about this sort of proportionalist ideology and the differences between the Jesuits and the Dominicans in this regard. And he told me a story from seminary when he was in formation, in which a Jesuit instructor was talking to him about basically the sort of gradualism of the law approach. And he complained and went to a mentor after this because he was frustrated. This moment in seminary, he really felt like he was being taught untrue things by his Jesuit instructor. So ended up talking to a Jesuit mentor of his, and this mentor said, the thing with the Jesuits versus the Dominicans and the way they think about moral theology is that the Jesuits want to fill heaven with sinners, and the Dominicans want to fill the earth with saints. And so the Jesuits embrace often, and not all of them, and I don't want to cast too broad or paint with too broad a brush, but the Jesuits tend to embrace this latitudinarianism if they err in one direction or the other. And the Dominicans proclaim that no, the moral law is the moral law. It is never contrary to charity. And in fact, God always gives us the grace to live and embrace the moral law as he has given it to us. But I thought that quip that the Jesuits want to fill the earth with sinners and the Dominicans want to fill the earth with saints helped me understand, in a nutshell, a lot of, I think, what the current debates in the church are about, and probably to understand Pope Francis, who himself is obviously a Jesuit as well. What do you think of that, though, Larry?
I think that's absolutely critical observation about Jesuits. I mean, one of the reasons why I'm very hesitant to say that the Pope is just a proportionalist straight up is precisely because there are close affinities between what looks like proportionalism and old-fashioned Jesuit casuistical moral theological thinking, as well as an Ignatian, and the Pope talks about this a lot, an Ignatian spirituality of moral discernment.
Mm-hmm.
That does try to discern in the midst of various circumstances in life what
Right.
the best moral pathway is forward. So I do think that's why I'm very careful not to say, oh, the Pope's a proportionalist. No, it's more complicated than that. Like I said, I think he's proportionalist adjacent in some ways, and he's sympathetic to it. But I think it's really this Jesuit background that is driving him. And all that said, I want to make it very clear. I actually support the more latitudinarian approach. I am a Catholic worker. I have a big tent view of the church. I too, and you have to have both the Dominican and the Jesuit approaches. You know me, universal cult to holiness, dude, and you know the need for a strong faith. Nevertheless, I think the latitudinarian approach is far preferable to a strict kind of we're a church of saints, a small club, you know, approach. But the difference is this: one can be a latitudinarian in your approach to things because one can always embrace the path of mercy, forgiveness, compassion, and inclusion, even as one, however, maintains the moral teachings of the church, not as ideals, but as commandments, as things that God does expect us to do, and that our life circumstances do not exempt us from at least trying to achieve those moral norms. See, that's my criticism of the Pope here. His words sometimes imply that if I adjudicate through discernment and accompaniment with a priest that my situation is such that I can't really live up to the moral norm, then that becomes God's will for me at that moment. Therein is the problem, because therein you've now turned what is a compromised moral situation that maybe a tolerant pastor simply has to deal with gradually. You've turned that into a positive blessing, you know, God's will in your life. That means that it's good. It means you're not doing anything wrong. It means you're perfectly content to stay right where you are.
Yeah.
And so I'm latitudinarian, but I'm not of the let's be content with where we are school either. I'm not saying the Pope advocates that, but I think his words can be taken down that path, most definitely.
Yes. No, that makes sense. Can we talk about Pope Francis's, since we've got 10 minutes left or so here, can we talk about Pope Francis's recent comments on the American church and how there are significant elements within it who simply flat out reject Vatican II? He spoke against this, you know, so-called restorationism that in his view, at least, calls for sort of a restoration of the church that existed prior to Vatican II. And I don't think we need to go too much into sort of dissecting the problems with restorationism. You and I have chatted previously about how today's sort of what we might call the rad trad movement in America often over-idealizes the pre-Vatican II period. And we have to be very clear-headed about this, that prior to Vatican II, there were plenty of problems in the church. In fact, the most clear example is that most of the priests who committed the horrific sexual abuse of the second half of the 20th century were all trained in the pre-Vatican II era. So,
Absolutely.
So they were the fruits of the pre-Vatican II church. So it's not as if prior to Vatican II, everything was fine and dandy. Rather, it's the case, as we've said before, that the Second Vatican Council was not necessarily co-opted in itself, but the reforms of the Second Vatican Council were co-opted seriously and taken to the nth degree in the wrong direction. And we see a lot of liturgical abuses and theological abuses emanating from that fruit. So, so without going down the rabbit hole of, you know, are the restorationists right or are they not? I think we can say that they are not right. But I guess the first question is the Pope right that there is this significant part of the American Catholic tradition that you know embraces this sort of restorationism? And maybe that's too simple of a question, because I think, as we've said before, he is right. There is some element of that. I guess a better question is, do you think he is overstating or overestimating the size and influence of this group?
Yes, and I think it's a little bit complicated, because he's clearly wrong if he thinks that the rad trads and their rejection of Vatican II are this dominant force in the American Catholic Church. That's simply
or I would say, or even that that the rejection of Vatican II is a dominant idea within the rad trads. I mean, there are I would say the vast majority of rad trads don't reject Vatican II. They have some problems with it and quibble with wording here and there, but they certainly don't reject it as an ecumenical council.
Well, no, not vegano style rejection, but there's deep, and you see it in social media all over the place.
Yeah.
Deep animosity towards the council, and it's only increasing, and a certain jaundiced eye cast towards John Paul and Benedict, not to mention Francis. But we don't need to go to them. I mean, the fact is, rad trads, whatever you want to call them, they're out there. And Pope Francis is correct to see that they're out there, but he is incorrect to single out the United States as this sort of hotbed of rad tradism that characterizes the American church. As I said before, the main problem in the American church is exactly the opposite, a lassitude, a sort of lukewarmness about the faith, and rather than a sort of strict rad tradism. But I would point out something that a lot of people aren't, which is that even if the Pope is correct that there's a significant number of rad trads in the American church, the fact of the matter is he created them. He's the reason why they're there. I guarantee you, if you did a sociological empirical analysis of most people that now self-identify as traditionalists, you would discover that a mere 10 years ago, these people were all just conservative John Paul II, Pope Benedict style Catholics. What accounts for this rapid 10-year transformation of formerly JP2 Benedict type Catholic, conservative Catholics into radicalized traditionalists? And the answer is Pope Francis. To use the buzzword of today, they've been red-pilled by Pope Francis. After years and years and years of adhering to Catholic teaching and fighting and struggling against the culture, but believing that Rome had their back and that Rome was the center was holding and the bark of Peter was standing firm, all of a sudden the Pope comes to the throne of Peter that doesn't seem to have their back. And not only doesn't seem to have their back, seems to scold and criticize their rigid Pharisaism, and then has all these ambiguous statements, and then trashes the traditional Latin Mass and so on. And I think that he is correct to identify that these people exist, but I think he's got a giant blind spot if he doesn't understand that he's the cause of it. He's the radicalization that has pushed these people to that. Now, I don't approve of the move that the traditionalists have made, moving so radically to the right in this, but he is the cause of it. And he continues to double down by, in a sense, rubbing the American church's nose in it by snubbing more conservative JP2 type bishops like a Coeur de Leon or a Chaput and people like that. Gomez, snubbing them in favor of McElroy, Supich, Tobin, Gregory, and rubbing their noses in the elevating of these kinds of bishops that are all like a recrudescence of the attitude of 1972. And so there are many conservative Catholics in the American church that are looking at that and going, why are we fighting these battles anymore?
Yeah.
When the center doesn't hold, Rome doesn't like us, so basta. We're throwing in the towel. To heck with Vatican II. To heck with all the reforms. It's Garrigou Lagrange and Latin for us, baby. And we're done with it. We're done.
I know that last year you were on, and maybe since then as well. I haven't seen you, but I know the last year you were on Michael Lofton's Reason and Theology show, which I highly recommend to my listeners.
Oh yeah, great show.
I had Michael on. I was on his show last year, and I had him on. I think prior to that, on my show to talk about some of the things from the Francis pontificate. Because he's had a very interesting journey, as you know, from Protestantism to Eastern Orthodoxy and into Catholicism, and then sort of back to Eastern Orthodoxy, and then finally back for good, I think, into Catholicism. Really fascinating guy with a great story. But we were talking about the authority of Rome, and one of the things that came up was, I think it was in the context of Traditionis Custodes, but how many people, like you just described, who had been evangelicals and then said, oh, I need authority. I need to go somewhere safe where the doctrine's not going to change. They flee into the Catholic Church, and then something like Traditionis Custodes happens, and they think, oh, no, maybe we're not as safe as we thought. And then it does sort of red pill them like that. And he and I talked about one person in particular, I think not by name, we didn't want to sort of point fingers, but it's a very observable phenomenon. You can see people on social media saying, I thought this, and now look at what's happening. I can't believe this is happening. What do I do now?
I think an excellent case study in this is Taylor Marshall.
Yeah.
I mean, Taylor Marshall, 10 years ago, when he's first starting out with his videos and stuff, whatever it is, was a sort of just conservative John Paul II Catholic.
Yeah.
An expert in St. Thomas. His shows were excellent. He was supportive of the sort of Vatican II and the hermeneutic of that JP2 and Benedict applied to Vatican II. But then as soon as Francis becomes Pope, you can see his gradual morphine into a red-pilled, radicalized traditionalist, vegano supporter in the whole 9 yards, which is a shame.
It is a shame.
I kind of like Dr. Marshall.
Yeah,
He's
I read
a smart
his book,
guy.
The Catholic Perspective on Paul. Very good book. Highly recommend it.
Yeah.
That was.
But the book Infiltration is not a good book.
Have not read that. I didn't even pick that up.
No.
Well, Larry, you've got 2 minutes till your radio interview, so we'll circle back like we always do.
Well, actually, my radio interview is at 4:06.
Oh, okay.
So we do
have
have
a little more wiggle room.
Yeah, a little more wiggle room, but we should wrap up.
Great. Let's wrap up in the way that we normally do, which is talking about the universal call to holiness. This always links back to the person in the pew, the person praying their breviary every day, the person on their knees at night saying their prayers. The church militant that's fighting here on earth. It's so easy to get wrapped up in the intrigue and the drama of it all. It's so easy to lose faith in the church that Christ founded. So what advice do you have for someone who is listening to this, is thinking like, man, this is like, we're in bad shape here. I don't like this, and it scares me.
Well, I would say, with the exception of your podcast and my blog, one of the best things you could do is to stop paying so much attention to the loud voices on the internet about all of these debates.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Because I think what has happened is that people sometimes think there is a bigger problem in the church. There is. And I think the Pope is part of this problem. In other words, the social media amplifies these voices to an extent that they go well beyond what their significance really is.
Yeah.
And so that would be my first advice. Just ignore all of the electronic chatter that's out there. I know I've had to do that lately too, for the good of my soul. But also just attend to the sacraments, attend to your own prayer life, attend to your own parish, attend to your own family, your job. As I tell people, this too shall pass. It is God's church. It is Christ's church. What was that? John the 23rd prayed every night, apparently, according to the story apocryphal or not. God, I've done everything I could. It's your church. Good night.
Wow.
And I think that's the attitude we need to adopt as we pursue holiness in our own lives, softly, and compassion and mercy towards those around us. Charity goes a long way,
I don't know if this is the case for a Catholic worker. Do Catholic workers pray morning and evening prayer? Is there any sort of promise to do that on a daily basis?
No, there's no promises that Catholic workers make to anything other than a sort of vague adherence to the ethos of the movement.
Got it.
Which is both its strength and its weakness.
Sure.
But my wife and I are Benedictine oblates as well as Catholic workers, so we do pray the Liturgy of the Hours, and I highly recommend people read Liturgy of the Hours. Go to apps like Hallow, that work for, or Bishop Barron's new Liturgy of the Word, Word on Fire, I should say, that you can order. Liturgy of the Word is great. It's a great way to just sort of tune out the clutter and attend to the voice of God.
Yeah, my wife and I have been for some time now praying morning and evening prayer together, and we do morning prayer together, and then we do evening prayer with the whole family, and it's amazing. I think it's life-changing just to be able to do that. It's a great, in secular circles we talk about centering prayer, and normally what that means is you center prayer on yourself and your own identity. But in the church, centering prayer means you center on Jesus Christ, and it's a wonderful way to start your day and end your day by just centering on Jesus Christ. And we've been using the Word on Fire, the new Liturgy of the Hours from Word on Fire, which is a great little resource, and it makes it super easy. So we have 1 month of that. We also, we have the whole breviary as well that we normally use, but we're using for 1 month. We're trying out the Word on Fire one. It's a great resource. Highly recommend. So I think that's a good recommendation, Larry. Pray more.
All right, we should sign off.
Sounds great.
I gotta run.
Thanks so much for joining me, Larry.
Thanks for having me on, and we'll do a follow-up.
Sounds good. To my listeners, if you have any questions for me or Larry, shoot me a note, Zach@creedopodcast.com. Look for the follow-up with Larry soon. And to all of you out there, God bless you.